I then removed this woman's heart, immersed it in cold saline for the purposes of hypothermic preservation, and carried it across a little causeway to the room where Dr. Shumway was preparing the recipient. So we cannulated the recipient, then he and I sewed in the donor heart, the graft, restored blood flow with the heart-lung machine in the recipient, and after a few minutes it started beating, and it worked beautifully. At Stanford, cardiac transplantation in the laboratory setting had been going on for a decade. The ultimate applicability of all of that knowledge to the human situation could not always be assured.
Dr. Shumway felt it was the time, and January 68 was the right time, and just so happened that Stinson was the chief resident.
It was both realistic because of all those years of training in the laboratory, and all the moves were routine. We knew them all, but at the same time, it was surreal. At one point, I even asked Shumway if he thought this whole procedure of removing the heart was legal, And he wasn't all that reassuring. He simply replied that time will tell.
During the early years, when everyone and their neighbor was trying it at home for ego and other reasons, and of course it was a gigantic flop. Not just nationwide, but worldwide.
After so many people had tried and everybody failed, there was a lot of publicity about that. Life magazine had an article that saying heart transplantation is dead or something like that.
Dr. Shumway described Ed as the one who took every obstacle, every failure, and turned it into an opportunity to learn.
Ed was the guy in the trenches figuring out how to make it happen.
Over the next few cases, it finally occurred to me with utter clarity that in order to do real justification in terms of the science and the clinical validation of heart transplantation, we couldn't go on simply doing a case now and then as sort of a fait accompli, something spectacular. I had to organize the entire effort into what I would call a sort of a multi-project grant centered around a central clinical core of heart transplantation. And these peripheral components would all be interrelated and would constitute what NIH at the time called a program project grant.
He, for, the first 15 years that I was here, ran the transplant meeting on Friday mornings.
That included the cardiologists and infectious disease specialists and immunologists and so forth. Somebody'd ask him a question, and Ed would swallow, and a few seconds later start talking in this very academic way that I thought if you transcribed it, you'd have a mini scientific paper right there.
And you can imagine this group, this transplant team, was not one that's full of sort of shrinking violets. It was a combination of his own native intelligence and his ability to navigate sort of what people are saying and understand it. But I think was for sure a big reason that transplant was successful in the early days here when it hadn't been elsewhere.
I learned so much from him, both about life and cardiac surgery.
Ed was my mentor. Every day we'd both have a hamburger and fries, and then we'd get out a cigarette and smoke a cigarette right in the cafeteria at Stanford. Nobody batted an eye.
Everyone who was near Ed Stinson learned from Ed Stinson, and the patients mostly kept going because of Ed Stinson pushing this huge multidisciplinary group. That NIH program project grant, I think, lasted 27 years.
Finally, by the late 1980s and the early 1990s, we achieved success. in terms of convincing the Medicare system that heart transplantation was in fact a genuinely therapeutic procedure deserving of support from Medicare.
Ed Stinson is so cerebral in his reflection of answers to you or questions to me or anyone else that he always reminded me that the quick answer is dangerous.
I think there's no doubt that Ed was able to have a fantastic impact on patients' lives that can be measured now, the number of heart transplants in the world.
One of the highest ways of serving people is to create new medical knowledge that is of benefit to humanity.
You couldn't give a bigger gift to a medical school and a medical center than what he did, which was to create the world's center for a body of medical science.
I take great delight in the fact that during my retirement, I have at a distance observed the program continue to expand with new ideas, new leaders, new technology, and better results.